Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us tonight. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet me yet, my name is Amelia Wald, and I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Club of New York. Normally, we are in residence at the Yale Club, so we would be having this conversation in a beautiful library venue at the Yale Club, but we are so fortunate that thanks to Zoom, that Jane and Dan can join us from Charlottesville and from Massachusetts, respectively. And Jane, of course, has a lovely fire in the background for a real fireside chat, despite the virtual landscape. A couple tech notes. You'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a Q&A box. That's how we'll ask questions throughout the course of the event. If any question pops into your head at any point, feel free to drop that question in the Q&A box. You'll need to include your name with it, and we love if folks would also include either their class year or where they're calling in from, since we know we have who's all over the world joining us tonight. A couple other fun notes is that as the audience, you can interact with the questions that are being asked. So you'll see that there is a thumbs up next to the questions as they're typed into the box. And if there's a question that you're really drawn to, feel free to give that question a like or a thumbs up. So that way we as moderators know that those are the questions the audience are dying to ask. So with that, I would love to hand it over to Jane. She is a professor of creative writing at UVA, and she is going to run the show from here on out. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Amelia, and everyone else involved in this production. It's really my pleasure to be taking part, and I am speaking to you from snowy Charlottesville, a place I know a lot of you probably miss. So I think that you know a lot about Dan and Modern Love, and so rather than sort of recite all of the incredible things that he has done and Modern Love has done, I just want to say a few things. I met Dan, and I'm trying to figure out when. I think it might have been as far back as 2004. And
really?
Yes, I think I'm sorting it out because I believe Dan and I were both teaching in a creative writing program in Charlotte, North Carolina, a low residency program. And I think it was when your wife had just come out with Bitch in the House, that anthology, and you were, I think, just coming out with Bastard on the Couch. So that kind of amazing pair of books.
That was 2002 and 2004. So you're
okay.
right.
All right. And so because there was a lot of buzz about it, and I know that I was really pretty intimidated because I thought, people who can know so much about relationships and about people, I was living alone pretty much in Germany, and I had no such sense. And Modern Love was, I think, just starting, or you were just getting it going. And so I was intimidated by the fact that you were doing all of these things, and you must be sort of have your finger on the pulse of like the emotional world of the US. So I thought, oh my God. But then, we would spend time, as one does in this sort of place, just chatting and having, drinks after class and so on. And I was so struck by Dan's, his warmth and his sheer generosity. And one of the first things he did was he just invited all of us to tell people we knew, tell our students that he was doing this, and to send him their essays. And that's, you don't get that kind of openness and generosity often in the writing world. It can be a little bit more, vicious. So I was sort of moved by him then. Years later, he ended up publishing one of my own essays and having to do a lot of editing to it, as I recall. So I got to see firsthand what he was like to work with. But I think that the generosity of spirit that he has really pervaded this whole widely blooming enterprise of his. So from Modern Love to the Tiny Loves to the podcast to the books to the Amazon TV series. I mean, so many different emanations of it. But a word that kept coming to me when I was rereading some of the columns in the past week or so, and it's a word that has been really ill-used and overused and just plain used lately, but I'm going to use it anyway, and that is democratic. There's something really beautifully democratic about what he's done. All the voices, all of the styles of writing, all of the kinds of love, all the sorts of experience. When people are making what can be most intimate really widely known, and it lets other people read these things and become aware of so many people that they would have no idea of. And I find this really tonic in this era. Earlier too, but especially now, to sort of get a glimpse of other people in their most intimate ways. So I really applaud Dan, and I know that everyone, all of the alums watching this now and hopefully taking part soon would agree with me. All right, so I have some questions for Dan, and after a little while, people's questions are going to be coming in through a more open Q&A that I'm going to do my best to moderate. But let's just start with some basics. If you had to chart the kind of clearest points from your days in the English department at UVA to modern love, what would they be? Like, okay, this happened, that happened, that happened. This is how I got here.
Well, first, let me just thank you for that generous introduction. It was so nice to hear about all that and be reminded. And the idea of the column being democratic is such an interesting, I've never heard that said in all these now 17 years. We're in the 17th year of it. But that's actually sort of the founding principle of the column, is that I was a struggling writer for a decade plus, like people often are, and facing rejection and usually, not hearing back at all. And when we founded the column, there was a decision of do we commission all the work or do we open it up? And I was in favor of running an email address and just seeing what came in. Because I knew there were so many people, not that I'm a, an especially good writer, but I knew that there were people of at least my quality out there who had stories to tell and that deserved to be heard, and that was the only way to keep the column fresh and relevant and vital, was to just open it up to the world essentially and say, send us your stories, and then the work is on the receiving end and sorting through all that. But I was willing to do that work. So I love the way that you captured that, and it's really sort of the founding spirit of the column, is that democratic aspect of it. Going back to UVA, which is going back a long way, I graduated in the class of 1985, started in 1981, and was really just about as empty-headed as you could be coming into college, and didn't know what I was there for except to have fun in some general way. But I think it was the fall of my junior year that I took a writing workshop, an introductory creative writing workshop, and simultaneously took a literature class about sort of the best contemporary plays in the 20th century. And those two classes together just lit a spark in me that about storytelling and the power of storytelling and that emotional connection that I just loved. And that's all I did. That's all I focused on. I had to get through my requirements. I had to stop failing German class and get sort of dispense with all of that so that I could focus on reading and writing. And I can't possibly capture the whole A, B, C, D of how it wound up at Modern Love, but it started with with moving out west. Like I became a ski instructor in Utah for a few years. Like I really didn't know what the path was to do this. So the path for me was finding part-time jobs that allowed me to write, eventually going to graduate school in Arizona, and then getting married and coming to New York City and getting just buried in work and surviving and giving up writing altogether, basically, for years. And it wasn't until we had little kids, we'd moved from New York City to Massachusetts, that we did those two books that you mentioned, Jane. And those were the launching pad for the Modern Love column. The editor of the style section read those books and liked them, and they did a story on us. And then he proposed starting this personal essay column. And the only experience I had editorially really was editing this book and working with the writers in the book. So I had to learn. I had to learn what it's like to work at a newspaper, and I had to learn what the concerns were of a newspaper. And I've learned a lot in 17 years.
I'm wondering, because as I recall, the people who wrote for those books, for the ones that we were just talking about, a lot of them, if not all of them, were authors, were already writers. But with Modern Love, there's a lot of people who write who are not technically writers. I mean, they're not aspiring or professional, but they're people who clearly are able to write something beautiful for this. And I wonder, what do you think makes people who are not, on the kind of author track, make public material that's so intimate, what do you suppose the impulse is? I know why we read it, but the desire to actually make things public that are so personal, that can be so intimate, what do you suppose is behind that?
I don't think it was this way at the beginning, but I think modern love has created its own community and its own material. I think people who send in those stories, who aren't necessarily writers, have read and been moved by the stories of others, and that their impulse is to do the same, to write something that would move others. I think the sort of vulnerability of the stories and the emotional impact in a lot of them triggers something in people, that stirs something up in people, that makes them want to make something of their own, usually bad experiences, honestly, to make something valuable and beautiful out of their own bad experiences. And I've come, the farthest I've traveled as an editor was from someone who thought he knew what good writing was, which was a kind of refined, stylized literature, to someone who often more appreciated simpler language and emotional storytelling. And some of the stories that are coming in that move me the most are pretty unadorned. They're really, they have to have a structure, and sometimes I can bring a structure to things, and they have to have some level of artistry, especially at the ending usually, but they're pretty unadorned, and they're going for the jugular. They're laying it out there, and that there's a real value in that, because a lot of people aren't brave enough to do that.
Yeah, I think the way you put it at the beginning, that people are trying to turn something that has been hard or painful into something that has value. That's almost exactly the way when I teach memoir writing, we talk, because you're trying to transform something painful into art that then other people can read and be moved by. So exactly the way you put it, I think it's interesting that it's it is such a core impulse, but not everyone can do it, and not everyone has the I guess the forum for it, which is one of the things you've created, which is so valuable.
There's something that I've seen, that I've observed on Twitter, which is that there are people, because the column's been going on for so long, there are people who are like late 20s, early 30s, who've been reading, who've sort of lived their love lives according to it in a way, like they have come of age reading it, and it's so sort of immersed their consciousness that I've seen countless tweets of people saying, of people valuing their bad dating life, saying, well, at least I can get a modern love column out of this. Like, at least, or even dating with that intention, like going on funny, strange dates, thinking like, at least I can get a story out of it. It's not a modern love column, at least it's a story. So I actually worry a little bit about that kind of manipulation of one's life toward narrative. But
You ever had to ask someone, say, wait a minute, did you plant this situation?
You have to wonder sometimes.
This is a question that I think has to be asked, and I'm sure you've already answered it in other worlds, but only a week into the pandemic, here at UVA, everyone went home for spring break, and then it was right during spring break that it all hit, and we didn't go back. And only a week or so later, because we were still meeting with students on Zoom, or we began to on Zoom then, the phrase, love in the time of Corona kept coming up. And people were writing, my students were writing things that were sort of love in the time of Corona. I know in the case of those young people, some of them, left for break, and they thought they were having a fight with their partner when they left, but it was all going to be better in a week, and they never got to see them again. And it was but it led to some of the most extraordinary writing I've ever read from undergraduates. I can think of one piece that was just a killer, but I'm not going to send her to you because it's too long. But so it led to these, in some cases, that I got to see fabulous narratives. And I guess I'm wondering, I think that you were probably in one of the best positions in the country or world to know how the pandemic has leaked into people's experience of love, all different kinds of love right now. I mean, I would imagine there are some social scientists who would love to get hold of your data.
Yeah.
You know? But do you think, have you yet been able yet this far in almost a year to chart certain kinds of large, sea changes or certain lines or evolutions that the pandemic is leaving in terms of how people are experiencing love?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating time. It's a fascinating time to be in journalism and to be living the story that everyone else is living the story that you're covering, essentially. And the Times building, we were told to leave. It was March 12th, I think. March 12th was a Thursday and March 13th was a Friday. And we were told, don't come back tomorrow and don't come back for 2 weeks. And I was like, everybody was like, 2 weeks? Like, how are we going to put out the paper for 2 weeks? And then, it's a year later. So for me, I mean, we had immediate conversations about content in styles and in the paper generally, and what are we going to be doing and what are we going to be covering and how. And for modern love is typically thought of as counter programming. So it's not playing off the news of the day or of the week or even of the month. And sometimes it can, but usually it has nothing to do with news stories as we know them. And when we first headed into the pandemic, we thought it would be more important than ever to maintain that people would want to not have all of their news be pandemic news, and that this would continue to be a little bit of an escape. And that changed almost immediately. First of all the submissions we started to get were all about the pandemic. And not only that, but everything that had come in before that seemed dated. It seemed like from another world. It lost a lot of relevance. But I loved reading the stuff from the beginning of the pandemic. Like, I'm not sure there's ever been a time in our lifetimes when there were so many relationships that had to sort of fish or cut bait. Like, there were people in casual relationships who either had to throw into with each other for a month or 6 weeks or 2 months or 3 months, or get out. And there were people who were single who were like, who am I going to be with? Like, people who are single in apartments in cities were facing total isolation for an unknown amount of time. And there were all these calculations about who am I going to be with? What am I going to do? Is this person worth it? Like, is this person worth it? And there were fascinating stories too about people who, a lot of people who are young, and it has been this way for a long time, want to maintain casual relationships through much of their 20s, because they don't want a relationship to become the dominant thing over their career and all of that. And so people can be intentionally in casual relationships and make that a pattern. And people like that were finding a casual relationship that became very serious. It became accelerated and isolated and serious and successful in a lot of cases. Like, the pandemic made relationships that weren't there otherwise, just out of being isolated together. So I'll be interested to see how many of those last, how many marriages there are. I think the pandemic baby boom isn't like panning out as some people predicted, because people didn't find like being isolated full time the sexiest thing in the world. But in terms of cementing or disrupting relationships, it was massive.
Yeah. Yes, I can think of a few examples I know of. To say nothing of the sort of the online conundrum, where you go from online to, well, okay, now we're going to meet and walk 6 feet apart, and then maybe we're going to, sit outside at a restaurant, and then when do I ask him or her or them into my bubble? And that's just so much pressure. So much pressure.
Yeah, what were the rules? Like, there weren't rules about, do we meet in person? Do we try to extend this? Is this emotional? Like, people were meeting on dating apps still. and I had some interesting, I mean, I heard interesting stories from people who, like one woman, it was very funny, thought that this might change men in a way and make them more, teach them how to be emotional earlier in a relationship, because that's all you had was sort of an emotional or intellectual connection through FaceTiming, basically. And she thought that for a little while, and then it turned very quickly to the men wanting phone sex through FaceTime, essentially, rather than like there was a limit, you know, there's essentially a limit of how long it would just be this this conversation. Like they they wanted to move it to the next phase one way or another, and she thought she was really disappointed by that.
I had such an opposite thought, and this shows how old-fashioned I am. I thought, well, maybe people will learn to, like, maybe one lasting element of this will be, people will become very sort of emotional and or sensually free more in their lives, and it's not all about screens, because we'll all go running away from screens. Or B,
Right.
we'll go back to a kind of 19th century letter writing society where it's possible once again to write letters for a very long time and create a relationship that way. So this is what
I think that did happen a lot. I just I liked her story because it undercut that narrative. But I think that did happen. I think people did discover different ways of connecting that were, you know, that weren't physical. There was no physical connection.
I've been wondering, because I'm teaching and we're reading applications now, and we're reading student work every week, and your normal creative writing professor reads hundreds of pages all the time, and it's easy to get weary, and then it's so fantastic to be astonished again by a different story, a different way of writing, and I'm really grateful when that happens, because just when I think I am now jaded, I have had it, I can no longer read stories of any sort, something will happen and I think, oh my God, people can still do extraordinary things. How you read a lot more than I do, I think. And how are you still able to be astonished? Are you still able to be astonished?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's yeah, it's the same thing you described, and the volume is more. I probably don't have the obligation of reading things as carefully maybe as you do if you're looking at applications and that sort of thing. But I mean, the submissions have gone from a trickle to I don't know how many we get now. It's exploded so much with the podcast and then the TV show. We used to only get submissions from Times subscribers, basically, and Times readers. And now they come in from around the world and from anyone who's familiar with the podcast or the TV show. So it's in the, I don't know, 12,000, 13,000 a year. I have no idea what it is anymore. And we can't get to them in as orderly as a way as we used to. But I can tell really quickly if something has potential or not. And if something isn't catching my eye, I'll start to skip around in the piece and look for any sentence that stands out, or anything that seems like it has potential. But it's usually in a voice, in a sort of, you can tell pretty quickly if someone has truly experienced something, or they're just trying to make something out of nothing. They're trying to dance around on the page, or but if they've really gone through something and are trying to write about it honestly, that becomes apparent pretty quickly. And honestly, we're so pressed, because not only the submissions at such a high volume, but our time has been fragmented by all these new projects. So I used to only have to read submissions and edit essays, and now reading submissions has become maybe 10 or 20% of my day, where it used to be 50%. So I will scan through, and this is a good tip for anyone who's submitting, I'll scan through like subject lines. And if you can write a smart subject line for your email, that's promising, you're at a huge advantage. If you write modern love submission for your subject line, you'll blend in with, 90% of the other people submitting. But if you write like a piece from the fall that I took on, the subject line was, "Please, Lord, let him be 27." And I knew that the piece was going to deliver based on that. I just knew it. And it was about a woman who was an older woman who had a crush on a guy, and she was hoping he wasn't too young. And he was only 24, but she thought if he was 27, that would be just old enough. That would be like 10 years younger than her, instead of, she thought 24 was really sort of unformed. And that's exactly what the piece was. And it was smart and it was engaging and all of that. But all of that was collapsed into the subject line. So if we can make shortcuts and be drawn to things by that kind of intelligence, it helps a lot.
You're gonna find a whole lot of really interesting subject matter.
I know. But then don't deliver, probably.
That's right. That'll be a whole different kind of bitterness. So I'm glad you mentioned that, between the podcast and the Tiny Loves and all the ways this has proliferated. I mean, the love story is, scholars will tell us, one of the most ancient forms of narrative that there is, and one of the most popular, that and biography. So now that you have this, all the different ways that you are letting these stories out into the world, how is it working for you? What is it like? What is the difference then when you've got, does it make you think of storytelling in different ways? Do you have to kind of recalibrate if you're looking at something that's going to be podcast or something that's going to be the very short?
That's a good question. I don't think that, or I can't think of any obvious ways that the podcast or the television show has changed how I look at the potential for stories. But it made me appreciate how stories can be interpreted and seen in new ways and presented in new ways, and how, my process is very narrow. So I will take on an essay, I'll work just with that author. My colleague will sometimes read and have a few thoughts, and it goes to a second editor who sort of does a polish. So it's not really an engagement with the writer so much, but it's very narrow. And the podcast brings in, in the old version, an actor to read, or a voice reader. And there's an interpretation that's added to that. It's less of the consumer of the story's imagination. Part of that is sort of taken away, but what's brought to it is the interpretation of someone. And added to that is a sound design meant to sort of heighten emotional response. And like I love the possibilities of those kinds of things. And then extending it to a television show. They took the stories and then sort of fictionalized them. They were real stories, but they wanted the flexibility to be able to create something new. And there you've got, screenwriters and directors and actors and a set with, 100 or 200 people on it. And it becomes everybody feeding into what this story is going to be and what the possibilities are. So for me, it was discovering that. And I guess in a way it's freed me from, you can get caught in media today and in newspapers particularly. You can get caught in a popularity game of metrics of how something is performing, of how many page views is this getting, and how many markets is it penetrating, and all that stuff gets quantified. And it's a bit dangerous to reporters and editors to be too guided by that. Because it's influencing advertising, and it's influencing the popularity of your feature, but it can be destructive. So in a backwards kind of way, one thing I like about the podcast and the television show is I don't so much need to worry about that anymore. I feel like there's value that I want a really good story that can survive in different mediums if it's going to. I don't feel the pressure that this has to reach a certain number of people in this form. There are other forms where it could reach people, and there are other ways that this whole volume, this whole sort of archive of stories is valuable, that doesn't just rely on that 1 week of burst.
That's really, really interesting. And I'm glad you brought up the fact that the TV shows are a kind of fictionalization, because I was really curious about how that works. I remember when you published my own column way back in 2009, I think, how much time I spent, because this was a newspaper, and it was the New York Times, and this was the day when newspapers were real. I know the New York Times still is, but things have changed a bit since then. But I had to spend a lot of time with a fact checker. And it had never occurred to me that I would have to have fact checked a very personal story about, in this case, my family. I soon learned when I had lawyers on my back when the book came out. But when you switch, as you say, from what could be a newspaper story that gets fact checked, which I guess I want to know if that still happens, and then to the world of where it's dramatized and it's going to naturally be fictionalized because of all those elements that you brought up. I mean, do you mind answering, is that a technical issue that the writer of the original column needs to be involved in, the sort of shift from one kind of truthfulness to another?
It's not a technical issue so much. The writers whose stories were chosen, which was sort of a long narrowing down process of setting aside a bunch of essays and then having screenwriters work with those. And the screenplay had to be successful. Like, it didn't matter if the essay was successful, the screenplay then had to be successful. So they had sort of an excess of screenplays. And at some point in there, like, I'm sort of the liaison between the writers and the TV show. The writers would find out that their stories were in a sort of mysterious, like, CC'd by an email way, that their thing was being considered for something, but they didn't know what. And finally, once like, at least in season 1, we're now through season 2, at least in terms of being filmed, but in season 1, once that was settled, I then went to the writers and said, congratulations, your piece has been chosen. I just explained what would happen from that point, and that it was the terminology, which is so important legally, is like, it was, if something is based on a story, then there's a certain threshold that it has to meet in terms of being authentic to that story. And then looser than that is inspired by. And so they went with the inspired by. And what's too bad about that in a way is that a few of the essays, like, it was really faithful. The TV version was really faithful to the essay. And then in some, they took the situation and then just completely rewrote a new story based on that. But the writers were thrilled. I mean, they were thrilled to be a part of it, and they got option money, and they to a person, there's just something really thrilling about seeing your story turned into this. And only in one case was the writer involved in the episode, and that was the one that Anne Hathaway starred in, that was about her playing a woman who was dating while bipolar. And the showrunner, John Carney, and Anne Hathaway both had long conversations with her as sort of a consultant to make sure that they got that right. And her conversations with them changed the episode in certain ways. Like, she had said, it makes me feel like I'm starring in my own, when I'm up, it makes me feel like I'm starring in my own sitcom, like I'm the star of my own sort of sitcom. And so that's what John Carney did. Like, he made her the star. There was a sort of a riff in the episode where she's the star of her sitcom. So, and that episode's been really praised by people who are bipolar, by people who work with people who are bipolar, as being the most authentic film representation of that they've seen. So paid off. Yeah.
That was hard to watch, that one. I mean, it was tough. I mean, I will admit, but this is sort of a shift in subject, but it's just reminded me of the episodes. The one that was about the two guys adopting the kid was so fabulous. And
That's my favorite one.
yeah, good. All right. So well, also Moriarty being in it helps. No, it was really well written and very engaging, really well acted and mostly well written. And this is sort of off subject, but I found of the tiny loves I'm really loving, because I think there's something they become so lyrical, they become so compacted, and you just get this like a little pill that then sort of explodes. And one I was rereading recently was the one about, I'm going to almost cry talking about it, about the man, I think it's a man whose father has been slowly developing memory problems.
That's such a devastating one. Yeah.
It's so strong. And the fact that, the last cards are just his own name, it's really powerful. So good job.
As a product placement for what Jane is talking about, this is our new book. It's the Tiny Love Stories, True Tales of Love in 100 Words or Less. And this column, it comes out every week online. We just print one in the paper along with the Modern Love essay each week. Started a couple of years ago, and it was my idea to start it, but the woman who does 90% of the work on it is my 24-year-old colleague, Mia Lee, who's wise beyond her years, but she does most of the curating of it, most of the editing of it, and I sort of top edit it. But I feel the same way about it as you. Like she comes to me with these pieces every week, and we have our editing sessions, and usually I'm like, but what about there's so little that's presented that you're sort of filled with questions, burning questions. And they often leave you unsettled in that way. Like you just don't know enough. You're hit with sort of emotional punch, but there's so much more that's been left out.
And that is the beauty of underwriting, I think. It's we're going to switch very soon to the Q&A of our alums. But before that, I have just one more question, and it's personal. Get ready. So, but there's two choices within it. You can pick one, okay? One is, have your own actual dreams been permeated by all the stories that you've read? I mean real nighttime dreams. Or have you learned singular needed lessons from all of these things you've read that you've really needed to apply to your own life, whatever relations might come to mind?
I don't think they have permeated my dreams, or if they have, it's in ways that are too indirect for me to identify. My wife always makes fun of me because I don't have an active dream life that I'm aware of, but when I have like restless dreams, I'm always driving a 4-wheel drive vehicle on a mountainside and losing control. And I had never published a single essay about that, so it can't be that directly involved. The other question is, I feel like these are the most indirect of self-help, guides in a way, but there are so many of them that have wisdom that's more valuable because it's narrated wisdom. It's like wisdom that comes from storytelling. So it's not just a platitude that's been dropped in your lap. Don't do this, or a set of rules. It's sort of a learned and humble wisdom often. But one of the ones that I think of the most often, which I take pride in having pushed for the TV show, which is the episode that John Slattery and why am I blanking on her name? From Saturday Night Live.
Tina Fey.
Tina Fey. That John Slattery and Tina Fey were in, and it was about about a married couple, actually the actor Dennis Leary and his wife Anne Leary, who's a really uh, great novelist. And she wrote this incredibly vulnerable piece, which is all the more remarkable because she's really in a celebrity couple in a way, and exposing their fault lines. But it had this, like, I'm a little skeptical, probably as you are too, of metaphors that are too obvious or clunky, or just metaphors in general. And she had this organic metaphor where she's talking about her marriage really being on the rocks. I mean, they were probably in their late 40s at that point. They had teenage kids, and one of the few things that they sort of did together was play, or tried to do together, because they were feeling estranged from each other and needed to bond. So they were playing tennis, but he didn't like to play tennis. He didn't know the rules, and but they played a very aggressive, competitive game of tennis, and would try to hit it where the other person wasn't. Basically, that's what you do in tennis. Like, you try to hit it where the other person can't return it. And that's like really good if you're a professional tennis player, but it's not so good when you do it when you're married and it's your partner. And it was fueling their discontent, and it was representative of the problems in their marriage. Like, they weren't in it for each other; they were in it for themselves, and that was represented in their tennis game. And they finally decide to get divorced. They're in therapy, and they walk out of therapy one day, and they're just like, "That's it. Like, we're over." And she has this sort of magical moment in there where that released the pressure. Like, that decision to get divorced was finally like, okay, what do we do now? You want to go get something to eat? They go get something to eat. But it changed the sort of competitive versus cooperative nature of their relationship. And then that became reflected in their tennis game, where it wasn't that much fun to hit it out and win, and have the game be over. Like, it was more fun to sort of rally and to hit it where the other person was, and so they could hit it back, and they could hit it back and hit it back. And it's one of the most brilliant metaphors for a working relationship that I've ever read. And it's the sort of thing that can keep informing your life over and over with friendships or relationships of any kind. And it was just so simple, but it had to be learned. She had to go through a lot of shit to learn it. And then be very talented to be able to put it to the page.
And I'm going to just make the assumption and say, and you learned that too by reading it.
Absolutely. Well, working on it.
Well, that's the point, right? Thank you. All right. I have now some questions that are coming in from the alums. And the first one that I think is interesting comes from, I hope I'm going to say names right. I'll do my best. Emily Ann Key in the class of 2021. And her question is, what is the breakup story you've most enjoyed?
There was an essay that we ran about 3 years ago. I even wrote it down here as one of my favorite essays, called The 12-Hour Goodbye That Started Everything. First of all, I love breakup stories because I get so many more breakup stories because everyone has to go through a lot of breakups before they get the one person they end up sticking with. But I love the breakdowns that lead to the breakup and how they're dealt with and how it lingers. But this one in particular was really a surprise hit to me. It was a very very well-written sort of interior story about this woman who'd been with this guy. They were in their 20s, and he was very adventurous and she was very not adventurous. And eventually he wanted to break up, and they had a torturous 12, where the title comes from. They had a 12-hour session in the car, where she was like, I don't want to break up, but like, tell me why, like why? And it just went on and on and on. They had to like take breaks to go to the bathroom and stuff, but it just went on and on for 12 hours. And then in the aftermath of that, she could not get over him. And I think it was a year later, and she's in therapy and all of that, but she cannot get over him. And a year later, she thinking of how he inspired her with his sense of adventure, she took a job on some, let's see if I have it here, on a boat or something, something brave that she'd never would have done before. And if you don't mind, I'll just read the short little part that's the end of it, because this affected so many readers. We've rarely had so much mail about a piece and so much chatter about a piece that was unexpected to me. I didn't think it was going to have this much of an impact. But she says, shortly after starting my new role, she's talking about this adventurous thing, I went back to my therapist and told her, it's been a year since we broke up. I thought my dream job and exercise would heal me, but I still think about him every day. What more can I do to let go? First, she told me a story about a man she loved in her early 20s, nearly 50 years ago, whom she still thinks about to this day. Then she said, you're asking the wrong question. It's not about getting over and letting go. I looked down at my hands and considered how this could possibly be about anything else. She said, it's about honoring what happened. You met a person who awoke something in you, a fire ignited. The work is to be grateful every day that someone crossed your path and left a mark on you. And that's how the essay ends. And it's one of those just sort of switches in consciousness where she was liberated by being told that. And there were thousands of people who are liberated by being able to read that. Instead of obsessing about what might have been, be grateful for what was and the mark it left on you. And it was a hard piece to edit. And sometimes I'm robbed of the experience that readers get because I'm trying to bring things like that out that aren't naturally in there. So then I can be surprised by audience reaction. And that was one of those cases where people were like, oh my God, like that's moved me so much. And then I'm moved by the reaction instead of by the essay, the original version of the essay.
Really interesting. Wow. Have you been surprised? So this is actually a question that comes from Victoria Hu, the class of 2012. She wants to know what types of essays get the biggest responses from readers, and are you ever surprised by the topics that readers love?
The essays that have gotten the biggest responses have had a heavy, you can try this at home aspect to them. And the most popular, which is one of the most popular articles ever to appear in the New York Times, is called To Fall in Love with Anyone Do This. And it was written by a woman named Mandy Len Catron, and it was about her interest in a psychological study that if you got together with a stranger and asked each other these 36 questions that cause you to be increasingly vulnerable and revealing about yourself as they go on, you stand a much better chance of falling in love with that person. It's an experiment. And she did that, and with not a total stranger, but an acquaintance from her climbing gym, and they fell in love, and they're still together today, and it kind of completely worked. But that essay just took off and went around the world and has been read by tens of millions of people and is still read by millions of people every year, 6 years later or so, and spawned documentaries and all of that. But it was so much like, you can try this, you can do this. Here's my story, you can do this too. And it's had that kind of impact. Like it really has started relationships. And also beyond that, like it was really an essay that had integrity. It wasn't a gimmick. It was real. Like if you sit down with anyone and ask those questions back and forth, you get to know them on a really deep level. And it can be done with friends, and it can be done with relatives. It can be done with someone you've been married to for 30 years. And it's effective, and it makes you both, makes a trick of vulnerability, because the whole problem, the imbalance in getting to know someone new and reveal yourself, is the fear that you're going to reveal yourself too much and the other person isn't. And you're going to be into it more than the other person is. And you're going to go too far and they're not, or the other way. But this balanced that. It forced it to be balanced, where each person had to make an admission of equal value all along the way. And it makes it into a sort of a game. So that's why it was so effective. The other piece that really went around the world was pure emotional gut punch, which was an essay by a children's book author by the name of Amy Cross Rosenthal, who is dying of ovarian cancer, and wrote an essay in the form of a dating profile for her husband for when she's no longer around. And it was really powerful, and especially powerful by the fact that she was so near death when it was published. She submitted it, and we had to sort of rush it. Actually, I had to sort of rush it into print, and she died 10 days after it was published. And so that one just, I get moved even thinking about it. But that one just, it's hard to write about death in a way that's not maudlin or that's some sort of tribute to a person, but in a way that's like fresh, but still has that real power to move. And she really managed that.
That makes me ask a question or voice a question that someone has sent, someone named Jordan Graves. It says, how is it emotional for you to read all of these stories? Like you said, many are bad experiences and you're the keeper of those stories. Does it get exhausting, and how do you cope?
It does get exhausting. Both the volume and you feel the aspiration behind the people who are submitting. Like it's a love. People think of it as a love column or love stories or romance, all of which I think are kind of can be diminishing, or words that sort of push things into a category. But to me, they're often the most important story in the person's life. Like relationships are the most important things in our lives, and the way that they turn us into the people we are and what our obsessions are, like they are it. Like you can have your job and that can be important, and but it's the relationships and how you're formed as a child and all that stuff that just it drives us, and it's the most meaningful stuff. And the people who are sending these, if we get 12,000 of them, it's 12, some of them are light and funny, but a lot of them are really heavy. And so we're not only reading those in 2 seconds and dismissing them, but then we're rejecting them. And that part sort of takes a toll. And honestly, you just have to sort of shut yourself off from it. It's hard emotionally. It can be hard emotionally to work with the people and shepherd them through the process. Often there's reaction to the pieces. People are very exposed in publication when they're not used to that, and there's that to deal with. So there's enough to deal with as sort of the caretaker of the work and of the person, that I can't. You just sort of have to move on from the volume of material that you can't deal with. And so many of them, and this is true with not just with Modern Love, but with any column where people are submitting essays from the wild. Most of the essays that come in are about losing someone dying, and most of those are about cancer. And so that amount of material coming in, there is a little bit of numbness that sets in, almost necessary distance in dealing with that.
It's probably not unlike being a doctor, I would imagine. An ER.
Probably. You have to protect yourself. Yeah.
keep doing it. I think we only have time for maybe one more question, and it's one that someone asked, and I had almost the same question myself, and I am, okay, so this is from Gerald Caruso, and the part of the question that I want to ask is, what kind of story would you like to see more of? And it's hard for me to imagine that there's any, because you have so many, but my version of the question was, is there a species of love that you haven't seen written about that you really wish you would see written about?
Species of love. I mean, my process has changed over the years, where in the earlier years, I was very eager to get representative stories of different situations. And I feel like I plateaued with that at a certain point. Like I feel like I halfway in or so, 400 essays in, I felt like I'd checked all those boxes in a way. Not that I was looking to check boxes, but I feel like humanity had been represented in a broad way. And now I'm really just looking for variety of voices, variety of backgrounds. I think that the Times readership, I don't think, I know, the Times readership is generally affluent, is whiter than the population at large. Like there are demographics of the Times readership that that limits what ordinarily would come in. But with the podcast, which like 35% of the podcast listeners are from outside the United States, the TV show is global. So and both of those go well beyond Times readership. It's a much bigger group. So we're starting to get a refreshing diversity of submissions. I have one that I hope, that I intend to work with, that we'll see if it works out, but you'll know if you read the column for the next couple of months, by a 15-year-old girl that is just really moving. And, you know, she found out about it from the TV show. And I have another one by an 89-year-old woman. And that range of just experience, and it feels great to have people aware of this as an outlet from all over the place. We're getting all kinds of stories from India, especially Africa, Nigeria. I don't think these are Times readers. I think they're people who find out about the column in other ways.
That's exciting in so many ways. I mean, that there's that sort of broad awareness of it, but also as a teacher of writing, that TV is pulling people, television shows and audiocasts are pulling people into writing. That's really
and it's a reverse process of discovery, because it's the TV show, and then they find out that oh well, this came from either the podcast, or then they go to the column from that, and they can sort of drill back, and then they find themselves lost in the archives and subscribing to the New York Times, maybe. Best case scenario.
I think we are out of time. There were so many great questions, and I think we got to a lot of them, but not all of them. So you look for them in your subject line, I think, coming up.
Thank you for those great questions. They're really fantastic.
They were really good. Thank you. It was really fun talking with you, Dan. And Amelia, I'm turning it back to you.
Thank you, Jane and Dan. I just want to thank both of you so much for your time this evening, and to the audience for all the beautiful, thoughtful questions that you are asking. If you missed any portion of tonight's event, there will be a recording of the event. And please keep reading and watching and listening to Modern Love and continue to be inspired. So I hope everyone has a wonderful, lovely night and have a great evening. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Amelia. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Bye.
Bye.